Good evening and welcome to the latest installment of Angus University. My name is Joel Kelli and I'm the president of Angus Genetics Incorporated. I think we have a really good presentation for you here tonight that's likely to generate a lot of questions. Should you have a question during the presentation, just click on Q&A at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and hit send. We'll compile those throughout the presentation and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. The goal of Angus Genetics Incorporated is really to fill the genetic selection toolbox for our members. And we do that through a very sophisticated, massive statistical analysis called the weekly evaluation. That evaluation pulls in information from a number of sources. Obviously, performance information, the animal's own performance, as well as performance on relatives. Pedigree and genomic results come in as well. And those genomic results not only provide some insight into a young animal's genetic makeup, but they also clarify the pedigree relationships to a much greater extent, which allows for a more accurate evaluation. And then, of course, progeny data. And I refer to progeny data as the gold standard. They are called expected progeny differences. And so to have truly accurate estimates, you really do need progeny information to generate those estimates. So it's through expected progeny differences that we fill that genetic selection toolbox for a number of traits. This is truly impressive, and this is a testament to the American Angus Association for their efforts in collecting performance information, certainly a testament to the members of the American Angus Association collecting all of these millions of data points over the years. You can see over 9 million birth weights and weaning weights. Some of the more recently captured traits like foot score, altitude tolerance, hair shed, those are coming in. And then at the bottom you see 921,000 genotypes. This database on its own is unheard of in the beef industry, but to have 921,000 genotypes in a beef database is truly incredible and contributes greatly to our genetic estimates and our ability to affect genetic change. So to lay a little bit of groundwork, and many of you have seen this certainly, but this is a very important concept, I think, as we dive in deeper in this evening's content. The performance or the phenotype of the animal that we see is made up of two components, the genotype or the genetics and the environment. And genetics can be further broken down into additive value, and it's circled because that is truly what we're interested in here. Additive value it's the genetics that can be passed on from parent to offspring, and that's what interests us most. So if we think of additive value in terms of a single gene pair, we may have an animal that inherits a gene worth 2 pounds for birth weight from the sire, and a gene that's 3 pounds for birth weight from the dam. That's 5 pounds. That is going to affect that animal's phenotype or performance by 5 pounds. When that animal breeds, of course, they split up. Half of the progeny will get the 2 pounds, half will get the 3 pounds. So on average, 2.5 pounds. So for that one gene pair, the additive value or the breeding value is 5 pounds. The expected progeny difference, which is half of the breeding value, is 2.5 pounds. The non-additive value, my animal breeding professor in college had an interesting way of explaining this. We think of non-additive value a lot in terms of heterosis or hybrid vigor. And it's when two genes that don't know each other that well, he stated, they get together and they have a party. So again, it might be 2 pounds and 3 pounds, but instead of expressing 5 pounds in that animal's performance, it might express 6 pounds. So that 1 extra pound as a result of that gene pairing is the non-additive value. Now, when that animal breeds, those split up. Half get 2 pounds, half get 3 pounds. So on average, 2.5 pounds has the same additive value as the earlier animal, but there's 1 pound of non-additive value in there. Environment is very important because it obviously affects what an animal appears and performs like. And we try and eliminate as much of that environmental variation as is possible. Contemporary groups are the primary way, as you know, that our breeders weed out or suppress that environmental effect. So a group of animals of the same sex, approximately the same age, that are managed alike, they're all in the same environment. And so that no one animal should have a tremendous advantage or disadvantage relative to any other animal there. And so through contemporary grouping, we help to address some environmental variation such that genetics plays a larger role in the performance that we're seeing in that animal. Known environmental effects, we adjust things. Adjusted weaning weights, for example. Because growth is linear at that age, we know what an animal should have weighed at 205 days of age. And so we can adjust them forward or backward depending upon their age and remove that known environmental effect of animal age. Age of dam is another one that we might use in the case of weaning weight. We know that bull calves that are out of first calf heifers, because that heifer, that female, has not expressed her true maternal ability, on average across the entire population, it means about 68 pounds. And so we'll adjust every bull calf that comes from a first calf heifer 68 pounds to bring it up to a standard with the other animals within that group. And in doing that, we address these known environmental effects. Again, addressing the environmental effects increases the proportion of that performance that we see that are due to genetics. And so that's why we do that. Talking about heritability, heritability is basically the proportion of the performance or phenotype that is due to that additive value. So as we look at individual traits and we ask how much is the data actually worth, it depends, and it depends a large degree upon heritability. You can see milk has a heritability. Milk is expressed by the female, or the maternal rather, component of weaning weight, has a heritability of 0.12. We know that through statistical analysis across the entire Angus population, that about 0.12 or 12% of the differences we see in phenotype are due to additive genetic value that can be passed on from parent to offspring. If we look at a more highly heritable trait, like mature height, which has a heritability of 0.59, the phenotype or the performance is a much better indicator of the additive value or the breeding value or the EPD of that animal. And so basically 59% of the differences we see in animals in mature height is due to that additive value that can be passed on from parent to offspring. At this time, I'm going to bring on Kelli Retallick, our Director of Genetic and Genomic Programs at AGI, and she's going to do a little bit deeper dive, and she's also going to present you with a really, really interesting case study. Kelli?
Perfect. Well, thanks, Joel, for that introduction, and thanks for laying the foundational groundwork for tonight. So we talked about mature height and how that has a really high heritability, and how we can make really quick genetic progress with a trait like mature height that has almost a 60% heritability. And I think we can all see that in the cattle industry over time, right? When we think about how we've made cattle that are well over the height of my head, down to belt buckle cattle that we had shortly thereafter, and now up into the cattle that we have in today's climate, we can make fast genetic progress and make fast change in phenotype because that trait has a very high heritability. But one trait that gets a little bit trickier for us to decipher with our genetic evaluation, and this isn't just at the American Angus Association, but really in any genetic evaluation that really starts to look at beef cattle performance, is this idea of what is the value of a cow's weaning progeny record in the genetic evaluation. So when we talk about a cow's weaning record, a lot of times we get the phone call from individual producers and they're looking at the EPD value on their cow and they're looking at the actual performance data. And while that is the actual performance data that you're seeing within your herd, that is your real life, right? That is what you're experiencing in your individual herd. And a lot of times we get into the conversation about a particular cow having a weaning ratio of 3:108, for example. So that means that those 3 calves that she's produced, weaned off, and has reported to the association have basically been 8% above average in their individual contemporary groups that were reported by that individual breeder. So like as Joel was discussing, as we're trying to parse out those genetic from those environmental effects, when we think about ratios, and really at the advent of ratios, the idea behind them were to try and parse out some of these known known environmental characteristics. So think of things like age of calf. You know, Joel mentioned trying to adjust that age of calf. Obviously, when you get your adjusted weights back, it's at 205 days of age. But we know that you're not weaning each individual calf at 205 days of age, and so we take that whole group and we either adjust up or adjust down that age of calf so we can get it to a 205 adjusted weight. From there, we look at things like age of dam. Joel mentioned this again. When we think about a young female, she's still growing, she's still putting some of her nutritional requirements and her energy into really maintaining herself, growing herself. And so we use things such as age of dam adjustments that allow us to give a little bit more credit to those younger females who are still trying to grow, who are still trying to get to their full-fledged potential as a mature cow, versus a cow that's been in our herd for 5 or 6 years and she's well on her way just to really focus on producing for that calf and making sure it grows up big and strong. With within herd ratios, it really allowed producers to start to basically weed out those two components and really start to look at, okay, what is the average, or excuse me, what is the ratio of performance data within a contemporary group? But as you all know, when we talk about within herd ratios, they're just that. They just allow us to basically rank animals within a single contemporary group. So we would really rely on something that we call BLUP models that we use in our EPD calculations. So BLUP stands for Best Linear Unbiased Prediction, and what that does is give us a little bit of a notch up in order to compare animals across herd and really start to parse apart more of those environmental effects. The one thing that it does is it allows us to account for a genetic level in contemporary group. So let's say you yourself have a herd of cows that you've really been driving genetic potential over the last several years, and you've really driven that genetic potential up to a higher level compared to your neighbor who maybe isn't driving the genetics as hard as their own individual herd. Well, you both could come out with a weaning ratio of 108, but we know that your 108 compared to your neighbor's 108 may not be the same. You may have a more competitive group of individual animals that are coming up with that 108 ratio. When we talk about non-random mating, so when we think about ratios, those ratios assume non-random mating. So that means you're not selectively mating individual animals. But we know that's not realistic from a farmer ranch level. You guys are meticulously mating each individual mating, and it's not random. It's completely non-random mating because you guys are trying to offset, you're trying to balance, you're trying to breed up deficits that you may see in your own herd and trying to get them to a genetic level to really try to drive the genetic progress in the next generation. And then with that, the environmental factors that aren't known. Besides age of calf and age of dam, those ratios really aren't able to parse apart many of the environmental factors that we can experience from contemporary group to contemporary group. And this is really the pinnacle as to why we can't use ratios to compare individual genetic levels across different contemporary groups, even if those contemporary groups are within your own herd. So we get into this debate of nature versus nurture. What's really genetic and what's coming from the environment? And progeny weaning records are really kind of a testament to this whole nature versus nurture debate, because we have to deal with things such as permanent, temporary, and residual environmental effects. So the one thing that we know with the individual weaning record, when they're getting reported on a female, she's collecting progeny weaning weights as a dam, is that she has a permanent environmental factor of her own. So when we're talking about a permanent environmental factor, think of that female maybe throughout her lifetime. Think of that calf food nutrition. Think of the fact that maybe she calved early in her lifespan. Think of the fact that maybe she's just a beast in the cow herd, right? Her pecking order's high. She's the first one to the bunk every time. She's the one that gets the best spot in the shade. She's the one that gets to the water tank first. We have those permanent environmental factors that basically can attribute to some of the performance traits that we're seeing in these progeny weaning weights. So when we talk about weaning weight records, it's important to remember that we're working with a repeated records model. And this repeated records model is used because obviously in an ideal world, we're going to get more than one calf progeny weight on an individual female. So when we think about this, on average, we want our cows to stay in the herd at least till 6 years of age in order for her to start to break even, pick up her replacement costs, those types of things. And so we need special models to account for these repeated measures. On the other hand, we also have to remember that there's really two components to this weaning weight. You know that when we talk about a milk EPD, we're not out there stripping cows, we're not out there weighing or measuring how much milk they produce every day, but rather the milk EPD, that maternal milk EPD, is really just the maternal component to weaning weight. So for weaning weight, we have that direct component. And when we think of that direct component, think of your weaning weight EPD, right? That's that animal's own potential to get up and grow. And then when we think of the maternal component to weaning weight, that's the influence that the dam has at creating more pounds at weaning for that particular calf. So that direct weaning weight component is around 28% heritable. So again, that's 28% of that trait is actually controlled by genetics versus the environment. And then when we think about the maternal component, that's actually a 12% heritability. So much lower heritability. And then that permanent environmental effect that we were just discussing, that accounts for about 9% of the variance that we see in this repeatability, in this repeatable measures trait. So anytime that you're talking about repeatability, it's important to note that the repeatability of a given trait is usually going to be a little bit higher than the actual heritability of that trait. So in this instance, we're talking about maternal heritability, and the repeatability is 21%. So that's just how accurately can we measure that trait from cycle to cycle. And then when we look at a trait like weaning weight, once we parse apart the heritability, the repeatability, we come up with a residual of 51%. So that's basically just environmental factors that aren't known. Those are the unknown environmental factors that Joel was talking about a few minutes ago with us. So the reason this is important is because it's important to understand how a repeated records model works, because it affects how much weight or how much influence a particular weight record has on the dam's milk EPD. So when we talk about maternal milk, we kind of got two things working for us. We have a low heritability estimate to begin with. So remember, low heritability means that an individual performance record isn't going to have as much influence on a individual EPD. So if we had a heritability of 1, that would mean 100% of the variation would be explained by genetics. And then with that, obviously, with a heritability of 1, you would have a lot of influence on the accuracy of that individual trait. However, with a 12% heritability for an individual trait, we're not going to be able to move that accuracy level quite as quickly. With that, when we talk about basically the number of repeated measures we get on an individual cow, each repeated measure actually has less of an incremental increase in the overall accuracy. So let's take a look at this graph. When we take a look at this graph, you can basically see that we have BIF accuracy over here on this y-axis. On the secondary y-axis, we have the incremental increase in accuracy as we add progeny to this genetic evaluation. So when that dam enters the evaluation as a dam with a progeny record, you can see that the one progeny record has a bigger incremental increase in accuracy compared to her 11th or her 13th or her 20th progeny record. Even with 20 milking records, now this would be 20 actual weaning calves that she weaned and reported into the association, you still wouldn't get above a 0.3 accuracy, EPD accuracy, because of the fact that as we add more and more of those repeated measures, we basically plateau the amount of accuracy that we can gain for that individual milk EPD. So as we continue on and as we add more of those records, basically the value of those records actually depletes from an accuracy standpoint when we're talking about the cow's maternal milk EPD. So we just talked about repeated records. We talked about the value of heritability and really what surrounds and what are kind of the nuances around this maternal milk evaluation. But let's take a look as to what has happened to cow EPDs since around 2017 when we made the switch to single step. So in order to take an apples to apples approach, we looked at the past basically 5 years and tried to examine, what has happened as cows have entered the evaluation and added progeny to their individual weaning weight and milk EPDs. So when we look at these two graphs, basically this is 2,800 roughly genotype cows that added 3 weaning progeny. And when you look over these two graphs, this graph here on the left, this is our wean EPD changing with adding 3 weaning progeny records versus our milk EPD and how it changes with adding 3 progeny records. And when we look at these two individual graphs, basically we can see that there on average is less than a 1 pound change in weaning weight and milk EPD. And so I think this is why we come up with this question a lot of times as to why isn't my milk EPD changing more as I continue to submit more performance records to the evaluation. And I think it leads us to this question about, is the Angus evaluation handling these weaning records correctly? And this was something that we really took to heart as members were asking us these questions, because frankly, if we don't think that the Angus evaluation is handling these weaning records correctly, we need to correct it, and we need to make sure we're getting the best tools in your hands as breeders. So when we think about trying to kind of get to the bottom of this idea is our genetic evaluation basically penalizing old genetics when we compare them to new genetics? The first thing that we want to do is we want to look at the overall genetic trends in our evaluation. So don't want this to alarm anyone, but basically what this is what bad trends look like in a national cattle evaluation. So let's explain to you what's going on a little bit here. So we basically have 2 traits on this particular graph. We have basically the fall of 2017 sire evaluation weaning weight, the fall of 17 sire evaluation milk EPD trend, and then we came up with basically a fake weaning weight trend in 2020 and a fake milk trend in 2020. And so this is what our genetic trends would be doing if our evaluation was doing exactly what some people have been asking us if it was doing, if it was actually penalizing the old genetics when they're put head-to-head with the newer genetics. This goes back to the idea of, are we conveying enough credit in our evaluation when we're looking at these overall genetic trends? And so this is what a bad trend looks like. Here you can see that basically a bad trend would be if this fake weaning weight 2020 trend, you can see that this has dropped for our older genetics and accelerated in our newer genetics. So basically it's inflating the new genetics and deflating the older genetics. And you can see the same thing happening here when you look at the real and the fake milk EPD trends compared to 2017 to 2020. Again, we're deflating the older genetics and inflating the newer genetics in more recent years. And this would be a telltale sign if we went in and we examined our own trends and we really looked at them and understood, okay, if we were seeing this would be a huge red flag. We would say, something's not right, because look how we're changing the level of genetics back in these older generations. But the good news is that the Angus trends have no trends, right? And so kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but Angus trends having no trends is actually a really good thing, right? Because when we look basically every 6 months when we run your sire evaluation report, we basically put them up against one another, and here you can see we ranged from the fall 2017 sire evaluation report all the way up to the spring 2020 sire evaluation report. And when we look at the trend for direct weaning weight, and we look at the trend for maternal milk EPD, those genetic trends are basically laying right on top of one another. And so that's a really good thing that your guys' genetic trends are tracking alongside with one another, because if they weren't, then we would either be penalizing old genetics or penalizing new genetics in our evaluation. But because our genetic trends are tracking alongside of each other every 6 months, when we basically put out that sire evaluation report, that's a really good indication for us that we are indeed not penalizing old genetics in our genetic evaluation. But we want to take it one step further. So we wanted to understand, could we actually have a case study to compare what we would consider and what we've heard from you all as breeders, old genetics versus new genetics. And so not only did we want to compare them head to head, but we wanted to make sure we were comparing them accurately by determining a genetic age for these individuals. And then we had to go in and we had to find young and old genetics in the same herd, in the same contemporary group, with the same management practices put in place around those animals. That's how we're truly going to understand, are we accurately describing the genetic merit differences between the old and the new genetics? So the first question we asked ourselves was, is this even possible, right? Are our breeders still using those old genetics in recent contemporary groups that would allow us to do this genetic evaluation? So we kind of did an overall look at our genetic evaluation, and this is just 3 examples of 3 different bulls, obviously various ages. You know, from the youngest to the oldest, there's more than a 20-year difference between those animals. And basically, we could see that in 2019, all of them reported over 100 progeny into our genetic evaluation. So yeah, we're still using those older genetics in our genetic evaluation. But the next thing we had to do was actually go in and find a group of contemporaries that are basically compared head to head in the same contemporary group. Okay, so we were looking for the old and the new genetics with that kind of genetic age spread that were being accurately described and depicted in these individual groups. Upon that, basically, we examined natural born calves from 2015 to 2019. So in this particular study, case study, we excluded our ET calves as well as our IVF ET calves from this particular study. We searched out contemporary groups with a minimum group size of 10. Now, we had a lot of groups that had a larger group size of 10, but we put that minimum requirement on there to make sure that we could basically encapsulate a little bit of the true genetic variation that we would see across the population, because obviously we have a lot of range in our genetic evaluation as far as range in differences in weaning weights submitted from different contemporary groups. And the contemporary group size of 10 was a good place for us to start. And then when we talked about what are we considering new versus old, basically what we were looking at was a minimum range in genetic birth year in the dams included in those contemporary groups. Okay, so a minimum range in genetic birth year in the dams of those cows that were having calves reporting weaning weights of at least 20 years and up. So something I want to stress here is that we're using genetic age, okay? So when we talk about genetic age, what are we talking about? Well, let's look at this example where we consider 2 cows that were both born in 2017. Chronologically, right, they would have the same age because they were born in the same year. Just like you and I have a chronological birth date, right? I'm going to be turning a year older in February. I won't let you in on how old I'm going to be, right? But I'm going to be turning a year older in February, and that's my chronological age. But in this particular study, we're looking at the genetic age, okay? So the genetic age of 2 cows born in 2017. So when we say an example of an older genetics, right, we'd have an average birth year of the parents. So when we see a sire birth year of 1986 and a dam birth year of 2003, that has an average birth year of 1995. Okay, so basically just a parent average of the birth years of the sire and the dam. On the flip side, a newer genetic animal may be a sire that has a birth year of 2015 and a dam that has a birth year of 2015, and that's going to be an average birth year of 2015. Okay, so when we look at these 2 individual groups, there's actually a 20-year difference in genetic age between these 2 individual animals that were born in the same year, but obviously represent genetics from different eras. Okay, so that's what we were really searching out in our database. The other thing I want to kind of get you in tune with is that we wanted to make sure that we were accounting for both the direct and the maternal contributions of the dam. So a little bit ago we were talking about that direct heritability component versus the maternal heritability component, that weaning weight EPD versus the maternal milk EPD. Well, when we went in, we analyzed this data, we basically used a total maternal value. and it's going to be abbreviated from here on out as TM. And what that total maternal value is basically the weaning weight EPD of the dam, right? Because the dam attributes half her genetics to the calf, okay? So half her genetics, as Joel alluded to earlier, we talk about the breeding value of an individual animal, right? A breeding value, half of the breeding value is going to be the EPD. And so half of the weaning weight direct value comes from the dam. So we're going to account for her full weaning weight EPD in this calculation. And then we're going to add 2 times the maternal milk, her maternal milk EPD into this total maternal. Why do we take it 2 times? Well, because the cow is expressing her full milking influence on that individual calf, right? When you think of a calf growing up, nursing, being influenced by that maternal environment, obviously the sire's not there taking care of that calf, right? The sire's not having influence on that maternal milk component. And so in order to correctly account for that total maternal value, we take 2 times that maternal milk EPD. And what this is going to do is it's going to represent the total expected difference in weight of a weaned calf because of the direct contribution of her basically passing down 1/2 of her weaning weight genetics and her milk influence on that calf, because she's the only parent that's going to have influence due to milk on that individual calf. So total maternal is what we were looking for in this particular case study. So let's look at some results. So out of the entire database, calves born from 2015 to 2019, with a minimum contemporary group size of 10, an average genetic age, a minimum age difference of at least 20 years, we came up with 787 different contemporary groups that met that criteria. Okay, 787 contemporary groups with at least 10 animals in them. So we had well over 10,000 animals in this particular study that we went in and looked at from 2015 to 2019 that had these old and new genetics in the same contemporary group. And this is kind of what we came up with. So first let's go over this chart a little bit. So when we look over here, basically on the rows we have dam genetic age. We have a mean dam genetic age in these contemporary groups of 24.7. So the mean difference, meaning the difference between the new and the old genetic age animals was around 25 years. We have a standard deviation of 3.5 years. We have a minimum genetic age difference in the contemporary groups of 21 and a maximum genetic age difference of 40. We drop down to the second line in these 787 different contemporary groups. The mean difference, the mean weaning weight EPD is going to be 18.5, the standard deviation of 20.5, the minimum -73, the maximum of 100. We look at the dam maternal milk EPD, we have a 1.6 mean value difference. We have 11.5 in the standard deviation, a -45 in the minimum, and a maximum of 38. And then this is the last 2 lines are the lines that we want you to pay attention to. When we think of that dam total maternal value, and remember that's basically the dam weaning weight EPD plus 2 times her maternal milk EPD. The average here is going to be 21.7. So this is the average difference between the new and old genetics, okay? The new and old genetics. The standard deviation of 32.6, we have a minimum value, a minimum difference value of -129 and a maximum value of 130. And then when we come down here to the calf adjusted weaning weight values, we basically have a mean difference of 17.8 pounds, okay? 17.8 pounds in the actual adjusted weaning weights of the calves in these 787 contemporary groups. The standard deviation among these animals in these contemporary groups is 81.7, okay? So when we think about a standard deviation, it gives you a bit of an indication as far as the range, right, that we have within these individual contemporary groups. So 95% of the calves are going to land within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So you take 81.7 times by 2, And basically that range around 17.8 is going to capture 95% of the animals in this individual study. When we look at the minimum difference, right, in calf adjusted weaning weight, we have a negative 227. Okay, so let's think about what that means. We have a minimum value of negative 227. Now remember, this is the difference between the new and old genetics. So that means in one individual contemporary group, the old genetics, right, actually did better than the new genetics in that particular individual contemporary group. But on the flip side, when we look at this maximum value, again, new minus old, we have a 326-pound difference in this particular contemporary group. Okay, so when we're talking about individuals, right, individual matings, individual management, individual contemporary groups within a herd, you can see here, even in this study that we looked at, that there's a wide range, right? There's a wide range in how these genetics perform within a particular environment, within a particular management scheme. But when we're thinking about a genetic evaluation, we're basing this off of averages in order to move the population in the right direction. So on average, the calf adjusted weaning weight was 17.8 pounds. So when we look at those two bottom lines there, let's look at the dam total maternal value of plus 21.7 pounds and the calf adjusted weaning weight of plus 17.8 pounds. That basically, when we start to think about all the environmental influences that we can have on adjusted calf weaning weight, on a calf weaning performance trait, and particularly total maternal, the difference between a 21.7 and a 17.8 isn't statistically significant, right? So we would actually expect those numbers not to line up exactly, but they're pretty close to in the same ballpark as what we'd expect. So basically what this is saying is that we predict the dam total maternal value of our young animals, right? We predict that difference to be at least 21.7 pounds, but the actual difference in the calf adjusted weaning weights when we compare the new and the old genetics, remember genetic age, is 17.8 pounds. And so this tells me, again, supports the idea that we are not penalizing old genetics in our evaluation, specifically when we go head to head with these old and new genetics in our genetic evaluation. And on average, we do a really good job at predicting the genetic differences that we should expect in the progeny for the next generation. So overall conclusions before we take some questions. Basically, just a reminder, maternal milk EPD, it has a low heritability, right? So an individual weight record isn't going to have the amount of influence on that EPD as it would if it was a higher heritability trait. Repeated records, the influence that those repeated records have depletes basically as we continue to add them to the genetic evaluation. And then just to wrap up again, what we just saw on that graph, basically younger cows had a plus 21.7 more pounds of total maternal EPD. And then when we looked at the actual pounds per calf they produced 17.8 pounds more calf on average when we looked across those 787 different contemporary groups. Again, there was a wide range in those contemporary groups, but all in all, when we looked across that on average, we were doing a really good job at basically trying to describe those genetics within those contemporary groups.
Very good. Kelli, that's a really interesting case study. And I guess the take home for me, and you touched on it, is that what a producer sees within their own herd may not be directly reflected by the genetic estimates that we are creating.
Right.
But on average, across the entire population, these EPDs work, and that's what allows us to move the breed forward.
Yeah, I think it really kind of humbles us as animal breeders sometimes when we see case studies like that, or we hear about those weaning weight ratios. But just keeping a realistic overview of, what's the difference between a ratio and an EPD and how we're using those records and what those progeny records can do, I think helps us all be better breeders. Yeah,
and so we have received a lot of questions. Thank you very much, and keep those coming. Again, click on Q&A, type your question, and hit send, and we'll answer as many of those as possible in the time we have remaining. And the first question that I came across is someone asking if I select on ratios, within herd ratios alone, will I affect genetic progress? And it seems to me like, yes, you will be, in essence, selecting the superior animals, but you're probably not going to get it done as quickly.
Yeah, and I think your last point, as quickly, is probably the point to take home. You know, if you're only going to a single breeder, right, to make your bull selection every year, and you're only going to look at a single contemporary group of bulls that they have available, you know, using that weaning weight ratio or the birth ratio or whatever it might be a decent way to select for genetic progress. But I think we've learned over time, if we want to select across different herds or even across different contemporary groups within a herd, we really need to use that EPD that allows us to do that. And we're going to do it a heck of a lot faster, right? If we're using the EPD that parses out more of that environmental variance away from the genetic variance to really get us to our goals.
Yeah. Next question. If my weaning progeny records don't have that much influence on my milk EPD or on the milk EPD, why should I continue to send in the data? And it appears to me that heritability is the key there, because that heritability of that trait is low. Each individual record doesn't tell us as much. So we need lots of records to accurately estimate that trait, correct?
Yeah, we need lots of records, and not to mention, you know, the part that you talked about at the beginning, you know, when we talked about how the genomics work with the performance data and just really driving this giant ship with all that data that we have leveraged in the Angus evaluation, you know, we need to continue to collect that data. And if you're not submitting the weaning progeny records on the dams, then you're not submitting the calf's individual weaning weight records either, right? And so weaning weight, direct weaning weight has a 28% heritability, so it's much more highly heritable, and so it's going to have more influence on that weaning weight direct component.
Yeah. Next question. Heterosis was mentioned, specifically relative to weaning weight in the case of a commercial black cow herd. How much weaning weight would be gained by using an Angus bull with an increased weaning weight EPD as compared to gaining heterosis from using another breed such as Charolais? Good question. I mean, we know heterosis exists, but it seems like it's very difficult to predict. Now, to use my earlier example, how big is the party going to be?
Right,
you know,
exactly.
to answer that question, we'd need to know the additive value of each parent, whether it's Angus, Charolais, and then we need to know how big the party's going to be.
Right.
And that's very difficult to predict.
Yeah. What are the gene combinations going to be, right? If that was easy, they'd probably have we probably have a lot more predictions out there around heterosis, but it is hard, right? And I think the part about heterosis is it doesn't create quite the uniform calf crop too, right? Because like you said, how many genes are you going to have influencing when they match up? What are they going to do? They're going to increase or decrease the performance of some of our traits.
Next question. How does the National Cattle Evaluation take environmental differences into equating EPDs?
Yeah, so when we talk about National Cattle Evaluation, we mentioned that BLUP, Best Linear Unbiased Prediction Approach. And what they're doing there is we're using, obviously, contemporary groups, right? We're contemporary grouping cattle within our own herds to try to parse out some of the management, some of the environmental differences within herd. And then also, when we talk about the environment, we have something called contemporary group solutions, environmental solutions that basically come out of our National Cattle Evaluation. Now, those aren't things that are put into the EPD prediction, but rather pulled out of that genetic variance component. And so one of the fundamentals of our National Cattle Evaluations at the beginning is to estimate those variance components, right? We take a large source of data. How much data is something we get asked a lot. Well, how much data it takes to make good estimates on those various components depends on, you know, how heritable that trait's going to be. And so if you have a 40%, you know, you think preliminary a trait's about 40%, has a 40% heritability, it's going to take us around 5,000 records, right, to be able to get good genetic variance components out of that. So we got to have those fundamental parameters down, and then that really helps us to understand and parse apart that genetic versus environmental variance.
Pull that environment out, yeah. Why does the accuracy value on my cows not always increase when I submit more weaning records to the association?
Yeah.
And I think you touched on that a little in your presentation.
Yeah, so that all goes back to that repeated records model, right, Joel? So when we talk about a repeated records model, that's sending in multiple weaning weights on an individual cow. And now these have to be natural calves, right? That cow has to raise that calf. Now I know some people, some of our members, right, they're out doing, they have very intensive AI programs. And that's exactly why in order for our growth data on those ET calves to go into the evaluation, why they have to be out of a registered recip, and if they're out of a commercial recip with an unknown pedigree, we can't use them for that part. And it really revolves around this maternal component of weaning weight. So just because of that permanent environmental effect that we have with those weaning weight records, it basically, as we add more of those weaning weight records, once we get past, 3 or 4 progeny dam records for weaning weight, we really don't gain a whole lot of accuracy after that, unfortunately. And that's just because of the nature of those types of traits that we collect.
Yeah. Question here on how DNA is weighted into the EPDs, and it ties to how weights are weighted versus the DNA or the genomic profile. But recognizing that weights can be manipulated by people trying to hustle semen from highly promoted bulls with small data sets, how is DNA weighted in the EPDs? Shouldn't a producer put more weight on the DNA rather than the EPDs? In other words, should they trust the DNA more so than the EPD, I think is the base of this question.
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? And I think we always have kind of differing camps, right? Some people like the actual performance data, some people would rather rely on the DNA, and I think the thing that we know as geneticists, right, and that we do in here is that you can't have DNA without the actual performance data. And I think that's something that as we continue to move through this process, those things are intricately linked, right? It's not like we've went around and for weaning weight for, say, Joel hasn't been able to find just 5 genes that yes or no, you have the good or bad copies and you're going to be good or bad for weaning weight. Basically, that DNA really has no value unless we have actual performance data that's feeding us and letting us know basically what those genomic relationships mean or what the value of that genotype really is. And so they really have to work together. And so to say one's better than the other, that's a really hard thing to pull apart. But I think the thing we do have to focus on is what's the accuracy values behind those EPD predictions? How many herds were those individual, whether it's a high-use sire or someone like that being used in different herds? And really just make sure that as producers, we rely on our members to provide us data with integrity, right? And our models can only do so much, and we really rely on you all as members to really send us in good data so we can use that good data to provide you good duels, because I think, what is the old saying? Junk in, junk out.
Garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, and that's a good point. The number of herds where this data is coming from, taking a look at that. So 2 bulls identical on an EPD. One of them has reporting from 20 herds, one has from 1 herd. Accuracies are roughly the same. Yeah, you might give the nod to the one that's from additional herds if this is a concern for you.
Yeah.
Why does it seem like only new genetic sires have all the higher genomic results for their EPDs? It seems to be this is true, even though some old genetic sires have calves in the crop that perform just as well by looking at the data.
Yeah, so when we talk about the genomic data, and what I think they're all alluding to is kind of this genomic score data that we kind of talk about. And I think the one thing that when we talk about those genomic scores, first and foremost, if you have the EPD that has the genomics already included in it, we don't have a lot of use for that genomic score. If you have an animal that can get EPDs, has a known pedigree, has that genotype incorporated in that pedigree, we really should be focusing on that genomically enhanced EPD rather than that genomic score component. As far as, all of those bulls looking better on those genomic scores versus the ones that don't, I think that, with this data set that we looked at tonight, basically putting those old and new genetics head to head, I think that supports that our data that we have doesn't see that on average overall. And I think when we talk about those genomic scores, the one thing you got to think about is that those are based on a training population, right? And when we think about that training population and the fact that we've had genomic testing in here since 2010, that is going to include a data population that's going to have, quote unquote, these newer genetics, these younger genetics included. And as you think about that, you have these newer genetics included there. You could be training that population, but that genomic score is just a genetic ranking, right? A genomic score ranking amongst the tested population. And so I think we just got to be realistic about what those genomic scores can really tell us. And I think when there's marketing opportunities out there, we never hear about the bad ones. We probably only hear about the good ones in most cases. So
yeah. It's another piece of information,
exactly.
The genomic score. Yeah. Question pertaining specifically to the case study. If the calculated total maternal at 21 was close to the actual case study results of 17, why is there still a massive difference in weaning weight EPD in old versus new genetics?
Yeah, so I think that thing, when we talk about that total maternal, the reason why we took that total maternal route is because we were really focused on the dam's full contribution to that calf. And so when we think about that full contribution to that calf, we really do need to take into account both that direct and that maternal component. And so when we think about that, maybe some of those, and it can trade off. I mean, we saw in that study that we had a wide range. We had some of the old genetics beat the new genetics in a couple of contemporary groups. We had some new genetics really outperform, right, some of the old genetics in different contemporary groups. So it's really kind of subject to the data that you look at, the different contributions that you have there. The one thing that you got to remember with weaning weight direct and weaning weight maternal, the reason why we look at total maternal is because a lot of times if you see your weaning weight go up, and producers can kind of look at this at home, if you see a weaning weight direct go up, the maternal component's more than likely going to go down. And if you see the maternal component go up, the weaning weight direct component, weaning weight EPD, is going to go down. And that's a balancing act that we have, right? Because there's a direct and a maternal component to that weaning weight. So they both can't go up in tandem. A lot of times they're usually teetering back and forth, and you'll see some with higher weaning direct values and lower milks EPDs, and some with higher milks and lower weaning direct values.
Yeah. Interesting question here on ET calves as it pertains to weaning weight. On ET calves, does the total maternal calculation take the 2 times milk formula from the donor or the recip cow?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's exactly, Joel, right? Why we excluded ET calves from this particular case study, because it does become different when we're talking about a recipient dam. And when we're talking about a recipient dam, if you were trying to do this with a group of ET calves, you would have to take that 2 times the milk EPD of the recipient dam and not the donor dam. And in order to kind of keep this on a level playing field, on a level service, we just use all natural calves born from 2015 to 2019.
Just pull that variation out.
Yeah, let's just set that one aside for today.
Question here, why do weaning weight EPDs continue to climb faster and faster, yet the average actual weaning weight has remained relatively constant?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And we've been in some conversations, Joel, amongst ourselves about this kind of particular topic, and in particular around our growth EPDs. It seems like we're continuing to predict higher and higher growth genetics, and we get this question, well, we don't see the average weaning weight increase across our commercial herds, for instance. But when we think about growth traits, they're all correlated, right? They're all correlated, and we think about, let's take the traits that we're actually measuring and getting fed back to us at the association, things like hot carcass weight, right? Hot carcass weight has gone up a lot over the past several years. That carcass weight is correlated to yearling weight, is correlated to weaning weight. And so I would say that our cattle probably do have the genetic potential to express that. Are we pairing that with the proper, and maybe it's not proper, but are we pairing that with the environment that allows them to truly express that full genetic potential? With that, I would ask breeders to think about when they wean their calves, right? Maybe we're weaning our calves earlier, right? Getting the same amount of adjusted weaning weight, but if we're weaning them earlier and we're having the same actual weights off of those calves, that can start to tell us the tale too of where we're picking up some of our performance.
Yeah, yeah. Why will the same trait from 2 different animals have the same EPD number, but will have different average ranking within the breed when they are updated weekly?
Okay, so the question is, why do we have animals with the same EPD, but a different percent rank?
Yes.
Okay, so the one thing that we do in here with those percent rankings, we have different categories, right? We have the current sires and the current dams, which are going to be obviously animals that are reporting and registering progeny with the association, and then we have those non-parents, right? Those animals who haven't reported any progeny. So I would say if you're seeing that, check into that. Check in to see what percentage scale that they're getting compared against, because it's most likely that one might be a non-parent and another one might be a current sire. Or if you're comparing a cow and a bull, obviously they have different ranking systems as well.
Different percentile ranks. And so that might explain what they're seeing here.
Yep.
When mating my cows, should I choose an older, more proven sire, or is it okay to choose a younger, more cutting-edge sire?
Do you like to gamble, Joel?
And that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
With the older, more proven sire, you're more certain of what you're going to get on average. With the younger sire, you're rolling the dice just a little bit.
Yeah. As we know, right, as that accuracy value goes up, we get a little bit better idea of where the middle of that bell curve is with that individual animal. So yeah, it's really up to our members, right? How risk averse or risk tolerant they really are.
Yeah, and this one, I'm assuming this one is relative to the case study. Did the difference between the genetic component and the calf's environment affect the overall weaning weight of the progeny?
The overall weaning weight of the progeny. So when we looked at them, we did look at differences, and so we weren't accounting, so basically that contemporary group mean part of it was taken out of it, because just like our genetic evaluation looks at differences among contemporary groups, not the actual value
Measure
of that
itself.
individual measure itself, then basically we were also looking at the differences within that as well.
Yeah. Well, that's the last question we have time for, but if you didn't get your question answered and you want to ask the question or want to answer the question, feel free to email Kelli or myself and we will get back to you. I would encourage you to fill out the survey. At the end of the webinar, the browser will redirect you to a survey, and we really would like your feedback to help us plan and make Angus University even better going forward. The recording of this webinar, you will receive a link tomorrow via email, or it will be available on the news and announcements section of angus.org. And we would invite you to attend the next installment of Angus University. It's on Tuesday, February 16th at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, and the title is Revolutionary Marketing. And it will address the revolution in feeder cattle marketing and how and why cattlemen should get involved. We really appreciate you joining us here tonight. Again, if you didn't get your question answered, if you think of one later, feel free to contact each of us. Thank you very much. Stay safe, and we hope to see you on February 16th.